Good day and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. We are now on to Genesis chapter 47. So we have three more presentations to go. Genesis 47 can be divided into three main sections. In the first part, we will look at Joseph introducing his father and his brothers to Pharaoh. In the second part, we will look at how Joseph was able to manage the worsening famine during the remaining 5 years. And the third and final section of Genesis chapter 47, we will look at the final moments in the life of Jacob. So this presentation is entitled, Jacob's Family Settles in Goshen. In the previous presentation, we ended with Joseph coaching his family on what to say to Pharaoh when he asked them about their occupation, which takes us to Genesis 47 verse 1. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. So we are not told which 5 of his brothers he took to see Pharaoh. So notice, viewers, that even as governor of Egypt, Joseph did not forget that he served at the pleasure of Pharaoh. So he took a select group of his brethren to seek permission from the king of Egypt to live in Goshen. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, What is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, Thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. They said moreover unto Pharaoh, For to sojourn in the land are we come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. So viewers, Joseph used wisdom by stating that his family has arrived in Egypt at Pharaoh's invitation, and that they have brought all their flocks/herds and are currently in the land of Goshen, because Joseph wanted Pharaoh to get the idea that they were shepherds. And as we looked at in the previous presentation, the Egyptians despised shepherds, which resulted in the king of Egypt asking the next logical question about their occupation. And his brothers followed the very script that Joseph outlined for them and requested of Pharaoh to remain in the land of Goshen. Viewers, the brothers said that they came to sojourn. The Hebrew word translated as sojourn is gur. It occurs 98 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 1481. It has been translated as sojourn 58 times, dwell 12 times, and so forth. So it means to sojourn, to dwell for a temporary time. So the aim of Joseph's family was to temporarily reside in Egypt for the remaining 5 years of the famine and then return to Canaan, but they would not see Canaan again in their lifetime. Genesis 47 verse 5 and 6 tells us this. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. So as we have just read, Joseph received exactly what he wanted, which was for his family to reside in Goshen, the most fertile area in all of Egypt, where they would be able to raise their livestock and worship the God of their fathers, Jehovah, the only true God, unmolested as shepherds. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. So viewers, Jacob told Pharaoh that he was 130 years old, but in comparison to his father and grandfather, his days were few, because Isaac died at the age of 180 years old, as we saw in Genesis 35 verse 28. While Abraham, his grandfather, lived until the age of 175 years old, Genesis 25 verse 7. So viewers, based on the information provided in Genesis 47 verse 9, The exact year that Jacob and his family went to Egypt during the famine was 2,298 years after creation. So, as I've been doing throughout this series on the book of Genesis, I've been tracking the biblical timeline from Adam was created in Genesis 2 verse 7 up to this point. And on screen, you are seeing all the patriarchs from Adam all the way down to Abraham. So the years that you're seeing on the left side is the year after creation when these individuals were born. The colored section is the number of years that they lived. And the years on the outside is the exact year when they died. And notice Jacob said that his years, 130 years old, did not attain to that of his forefathers. Because notice you can see right after the flood, Noah lived till he was 950 years old. Then you can see a drop in the number of years that persons lived until they died. Shem was 600 years old when he died. His son Arphaxad was 438. Then it drops to 433. Then Eber lived until he was 464. Then it dropped off precipitously when Peleg was born. Peleg lived until he was 239 years old. His son Rehu lived to be the same age as his father. Serug lived until he was 230 years old. Then it dropped off again. Nahor lived until he was 148 years old. Terah, Abraham's father, was 205 years old when he died. And Abraham was born 2,008 years after creation. He lived until he was 175 years old, and he died in the year 2,183 years after creation. So this gives us an accurate timeline from creation up to the time of Abraham. So let's now continue to track the number of years that have elapsed until we get to the current time in Genesis 47 when Jacob and his family arrived in Egypt. So since Genesis 5 has provided clear and definite markers that would allow any diligent Bible student to be able to ascertain the time in years that have elapsed since Adam was created. So I just showed you that Abraham was born 2,008 years after creation. 100 years later, Isaac was born in the year 2,108 after creation. 2,168 years after Adam was created, Jacob was born when Isaac was 60 years old. And this can be found in Genesis chapter 25, verse 26. Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old, 2,259 years after the creation of Adam. Viewers, since we know for a biblical fact that Jacob was born 2,168 years after creation, then he came to Egypt in the year 2,298 when he was 130 years old. Additionally, we can also confirm that Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old because the events of Genesis 47 took place in the second year of the famine. That can be found in Genesis 45, verse 6. And we know that Joseph was 30 years old when he became governor of Egypt and presided over the previous 70 years of abundance, which would make him 37 years old when the famine started. Therefore, Joseph was 39 years old 2 years later in the second year of the famine when his father came to Egypt. So by doing a simple mathematical calculation, if Jacob was 130 years old and Joseph was 39 years old when his father came to Egypt in the second year of the famine, it simply means that Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old. 130 minus 39 gives us 91. Viewers, Genesis 47 verse 11 tells us this. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Ramses here is of Egyptian origin. It occurs 5 times in the scriptures. It is Strong's H 7486. Ramses means child of the sun because the Egyptians' sun god was called Ra. Hence, Ramses was known as the child of the sun. Viewers, Genesis 47 verse 12 tells us that Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread, according to their families. So what this is telling us is that throughout the famine, Joseph also rationed the corn that he provided for his family. They were not treated any more favorably than any of the Egyptians. They had to endure the same rationing of grain throughout the 5 years of famine as all Egyptians had to because of the scarce resources. Viewers, let's now look at the second part of Genesis chapter 47, which is from Genesis 13 to 26. And this section now outlines how Joseph was able to manage the worsening famine throughout the remaining 5 years by implementing prudent measures. Genesis 47 verse 13 and 14 tells us this. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land fainted by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So during the famine, viewers, Joseph was a great steward. There was no embezzlement of funds. The grains that he sold and the money that he collected from everybody that came to Egypt and from the Egyptians, he brought the money and deposited it into Pharaoh's treasury. However, when the Egyptians ran out of money, Joseph bartered with them by exchanging cattle for corn, because as governor of Egypt, he understood and knew that there was no such thing as a free lunch. So notice what transpired. Genesis 47 verse 15 to 17 tells us this. And when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, give us bread. So notice what they asked of him. They wanted him to give them corn without having to pay for it. For why should we die in thy presence, for the money faileth? They ran out of money. And Joseph said, notice what he said, because there's no such thing as a free lunch in life. Joseph said, give your cattle. You have to give something to get something. You'd have to surrender your assets. Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money fail. And they brought their cattle unto Joseph. And Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, and for the flocks, and for the cattle of the herds, and for the asses. And he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. So this was now the third year. When that year was ended, so we are now into the fourth year of the famine, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, we will not hide it from my lord, how that our money is spent. My lord also hath our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my lord, but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh. And give us seed, that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate. So the people got the message that even in this hard economic times, this national crisis, this drought, this famine, they recognize that under Joseph's administration, they would have to either pay for the grain or they would have to give something in return for the grain. So the famine was so severe that the Egyptians became desperate and proposed, they were the ones who proposed that they become indentured servants to Pharaoh in exchange for food, simply because they recognized, even in a time of national crisis, Egypt was not a welfare state. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians, sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other end thereof. Because remember, the cities were where the grains were stored. Under the land of the priest bought ye not, for the priest had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them. Wherefore they sold not their lands. Then Joseph said unto the people, behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and ye shall sow the land. This is after the famine has ended. And it shall come to pass in the increase that ye shall give the fifth part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your households, and for food for your little ones. So what Joseph did here, viewers, is that he entered a contract of indentureship with the Egyptians, and they agreed to become bond servants in exchange for food during the famine, and give Pharaoh 20% of their harvest when the famine ended. So they would give Pharaoh 1/5 of their harvest, which is 20%, and they would keep the remaining 80% for themselves. So this was what Joseph implemented. This was his policy. He entered into a contract with the people to give 20% of their harvest going forward. Genesis 47, verse 25 and 26 says this. And they said, the people of Egypt, thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. So they agreed to the terms. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, or 20%, except the land of the priest only, which became not Pharaoh's. So Joseph was able to save Egypt by shrewd economic policies during the famine. And as a result of this contract with the people, he levied a tax of 20%, or 1/5, on all agricultural produce harvested in the land of Egypt, so that Egypt could emerge stronger economically after the famine. And that law, which was promulgated by Joseph, was still in effect over 400 years later when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, which was evidenced by the statement unto this day. And remember, the Hebrews would become slaves in Egypt for a period of 400 years until they left Egypt. So this was how long this policy that Joseph implemented was in effect. Viewers, 20% became an indefinite tax rate in Egypt. And this was the same rate that they were required to pay in preparation for the famine, as can be seen below. Let's go back to Genesis 41, verse 34 to 36, when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream and told him that there would be a period of 70 years of abundance to be followed by 7 years of famine, which we are now reading about in Genesis chapter 47. This is what Joseph told Pharaoh. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, in preparation for the famine. Pharaoh taxed the people 20% of all agricultural produce in the land of Egypt, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. So this was what Joseph implemented before the famine, and he implemented the same policy after the famine, so Egypt could come out stronger. And that is why Egypt was the most powerful nation on the earth at that time, because of the policies that were implemented by Joseph. So Joseph implemented a fair tax system where everyone paid the same rate, 20%, whether they were rich or poor. Viewers, I did a little research to look at what the current tax rate is in Egypt today. As of 2025, last year, Egypt utilizes a progressive personal income tax system ranging from 0% to 27.5%. So this is what Egyptians are currently paying today. So current tax rates paid in Egyptian pound, that's their currency, is as follows. If an Egyptian earned up to 40,000 Egyptian pound per year, they pay 0%. So they are tax exempt up to an income of 40,000 Egyptian pounds. If you earn from 40,001 to 55,000 Egyptian pound, you pay a tax rate of 10%. And you can see on screen that any Egyptian earning over 1.2 million Egyptian pound pay an income tax of 27.5% to the government, while Joseph's tax rate was 20% all the way back from Genesis chapter 47. Viewers, we are now onto the third and final section of Genesis 47, which takes into account verses 27 to 31. And this is a transition away from Joseph's handling of the remaining years of the famine, and it jumps forward in time by 17 years to focus on the final moments of Jacob's life. Genesis 47 verse 27 and 28 tells us this. And Israel, who is Jacob, dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for how long? 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 140 and 70 years. So viewers, Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt because he came in the land of the Pharaohs when he was 130 years old. He lived 17 years in Egypt and he died at the age of 147 years old. So Jacob came to Egypt in the second year of the famine in the year 2298 after creation. So he endured the last 5 years of the famine and lived another 12 years after the famine. Therefore, Jacob died 2,315 years after creation. Viewers, Genesis 47 verse 29 to 31 tells us this. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die. That's Jacob. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. So Jacob's final wish was not to be buried in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And Jacob said, Swear unto me. And he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. So viewers, Jacob's final wish was to be buried in the land of Canaan, since Egypt was not his home. And he knew that he and his descendants belonged in the land that was promised to them by God. God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that the land of Canaan would be their inheritance. And that is why the land of Canaan is called the promised land. Jacob had faith in God's promises, and as heir to the Abrahamic covenant, he made Joseph solemnly swear to fulfill his dying wish. Viewers, as we looked at in Genesis 24 verse 1 to 9, when Abram was about to die, and he made his eldest servant to do this same custom and promise and swear that he would not take a bride for Isaac from among the daughters of the Canaanites, but that he would go back to Abraham's land of nativity, the land of Haran, to take a bride for Isaac. And we read and studied that time that his eldest servant went back to the land of Haran in Mesopotamia and took back Rebekah as a bride for Isaac. So thigh was a euphemism for the male sex organ, that is the penis and testicles, which generates life. So by placing his hand under Jacob's thigh, Joseph was now obligated to fulfill his oath or be subjected to the wrath of Jacob's offspring if he did not fulfill his sworn duty. And as we know, at this time, his brothers would not be in a position to do Joseph any harm because Joseph was the governor of Egypt. But this was a custom. If you make this solemn oath by placing your hand under the person's quote-unquote thigh, which is their genitals, to include the scrotum, the testicles, you had to fulfill your oath, because the possible punishment for breaking such an oath included sterility by castration or death. Viewers, today we swear on Bibles, especially in the courts, by raising our right hand, but back then, that was a custom and culture of the time. Here is the proof that the word thigh is used euphemistically to refer to the loins as the seat of procreative power. So the Hebrew word translated as thigh is Alric. It occurs 34 times. It can mean the literal thigh, or it can mean the genitals or the loins. So Alric euphemistically means the generative parts, meaning the penis along with the scrotum, which produces the sperm or the semen that generates life. So viewers, that brings us to the end of this presentation on Genesis chapter 47, where we looked at Joseph introducing his father and his brethren to Pharaoh, seeking permission for them to live in the land of Goshen. Then we also looked at, in the second part of this chapter, how Joseph was able to manage the remaining 5 years of the famine and the policies that he implemented to ensure that Egypt was able to provide for its citizens and to come out stronger after the end of the famine. And in the third and final part, we just looked at Jacob's final wish as he was about to die, where he made Joseph swear that he would not bury him in the land of Egypt, but take him back to the land of his fathers, the land of Canaan, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by God to be their homeland. And this was the land that would take Jacob's name. Jacob was renamed Israel. And today, that piece of land is called Israel because it was named after Jacob. And that is where Jacob is buried today. In the next presentation on Genesis chapter 48, we will look at Jacob blessing Joseph's two sons. And again, we will see that Joseph was the one who actually got the birthright. And this birthright would have passed on to Joseph's son, Ephraim. So the next presentation, we'll look at Jacob blessing Joseph's two sons. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and may God continue to bless us as we continue to study his words to prove all things. Have yourselves a wonderful day.